first ever Russia-Africa Summit is underway now in the resort town of Sochi. The summit is welcoming 43 African dignitaries where they're meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and other top officials. Now, the meetings are taking place with the aim of boosting cooperation and Moscow possibly expanding its presence across the entire African continent. RT's Ilya Petrenko has the story.
The list of deliveries is expanding, with the share of processed agricultural products increasing. Russia is one of the top 10 largest food suppliers on the African market. We are exporting more agricultural products there than weapons.
So Africa has come to Russia to get Russia to come to Africa more often. That pretty much explains what we're seeing in Sochi on Wednesday and Thursday, the first event of its kind. All the African leaders have been invited to the Black Sea resort, and almost all of them made it. So we are going to see nearly 50 leaders in here. Global economic powerhouses such as, of course, the US, China, and the EU, which, as some say, do have a reputation of really being eager to try and get a slice of the African pie. After all, 30% of the world's natural reserves is a serious incentive. Well, in the past, they have organized similar events, but now it's Russia's turn. But the Russian officials, the most senior of them, who we are going to see at the forum, of course, have said that Moscow's approach is completely different. I do have to point out that President Vladimir Putin, just before the summit began, in one of the interviews, even blamed the Western countries for putting on a new face, yet still trying to exploit the African countries mercilessly to their own benefit. Although, according to Mr. Putin, that's not a plan for Russia. In the next 36 hours or so, we are going to see whether the Russian officials will deliver on their promises and commitments. Most notably, Vladimir Putin will be getting together with the leaders of Africa's strongest economies, such as Egypt and South Africa. And RT will be bringing you all the latest updates from the Russia-Africa Summit here in Sochi.
And for more on this summit in Sochi, let's head over now to Abayomi Azikiwe, editor of Pan-African Newswire. Sir, thank you for being with us. So much of the U.S. has focused on the Russia-Africa Summit as a way for Russia to increase its influence on the African continent to rival the extensive U.S. presence that's already there. Do you agree with that kind of framing? And how much do you think Africa will benefit from the increased Russian influence?
No, I don't agree with that type of framing. Even during the period of the Soviet Union, which collapsed in 1991, there was extensive cooperation and agreements and assistance by the Soviet Union to various African states, military assistance, joint economic projects, cultural exchanges, and a myriad of other types of cooperative projects. So I think this is a continuation of that legacy. The Russian Federation now is reemerging as a world power, and it only stands to reason that they would be trying to enhance their relationships with the African Union member states, which there are 55 of them.
And some of the topics planned for discussion at the summit include nuclear technology, mineral extraction, and of course, weapons deals. So let me ask you this. As long as there is a demand in Africa for weapons, there will likely be a lot of international suppliers, which include Russia as well. But how do you think that impacts regional stability on the whole continent?
I think there needs to be a balance between the military cooperation and assistance and even occupation by the U.S. and Britain and France, and a balance in terms of the involvement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. I don't believe that the Russian Federation wants to put bases, even temporary bases, on the continent, but we see the U.S. through the U.S. Africa Command having a permanent base in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa and other temporary makeshift bases in other parts of Africa. So I think it's going to be a different character in regard to military cooperation than what already exists and has existed for decades vis-a-vis the Western countries and the AU member states.
Now, we've also seen, especially in the past decade, that China has really put their fingers on the continent, really doing a lot of investments in roads and infrastructure and what have you. But unlike China, Vladimir Putin has promised to increase cooperation with African countries without what he calls, quote, political or other interference. Do you think this is a response to growing African resentment towards the Chinese and their efforts to influence the continent?
No, I haven't noticed any growing resentment in regard to Africa-China relations. There's the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation and meets every few years. It's been in existence since 2000. To a large degree, China now is the largest trading partner collectively with the African Union member states. If Russian Federation respects the sovereignty and independence of the AU member states, then there won't be any problem in regard to cooperation between Moscow and the various capitals on the African continent. And this is much appreciated by African countries because historically there's been significant interference in the internal affairs of Africa by the United States, Britain, and France, and that continues today.
All right, real quickly, do you think Africa is ultimately going to align more closely with the likes of like China and Russia? And do you think the U.S. is kind of losing their platform and their stance with the African Union?
We've already seen it happening over the last decade, a decade and a half, with the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa summit, the BRICS summit that meets periodically. And we've also seen, of course, FOCAC, and now with a greater push by the Russian Federation, there's clearly a new world economic order emerging internationally. And I don't think the United States is going to be able to play the role that it has played over the last period since the conclusion of World War II.
Very fascinating developments there. Abayomi Azikiwe, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.